Welcome to this introduction to chapter 11, which is on fiscal policy. So far we have neglected the government in our analysis, but in this chapter 11 we add the government to our model and we take a close look at the role of the government in the economy. We first look at the size of the public sector. How big is the government if you look at the income side and the user side and the production side? Most of the chapter is focused on two questions, where one is a long-run question and the other is a short-run question. And the long-run question is, are public finances sustainable? What budget deficit is compatible with sustainable public finances in the long run? And the short-run question is, what role can fiscal policy play in stabilizing the economy in the short run? Can fiscal policy help to stabilize production and employment? There's a discussion of various practical aspects of fiscal policy. There's also a look at the data, how fiscal policy has evolved in a number of different countries. So, how important is the government? Well, we can look at data for the Eurozone in 2009, all those countries taken together, as an example. And there we see that in the Eurozone in 2009, 45% of GDP was collected in taxes and other income of the state, mainly taxes. And then if you look at how the government was spending, then 22% of GDP was used for government consumption. So this is things like expenditure on government-financed healthcare, government-financed education, defense, police, and things like that. And then 3% of GDP was used for government investment, and that is building of roads and schools and purchases of fighter jets and so on. So government consumption and investment is a quarter of GDP. So what did the government do with the rest of the money? Well, an equally large fraction almost was used for transfers. And transfers is when the government hands cash primarily to households. Transfers are things like pensions, welfare payments, child allowances, and so on. And finally, 2% of GDP was used for net interest payments. So the government has both financial debt and financial assets, but the net interest payments were 2% of GDP. So if you sum the spending of the government, you see that is 50% of GDP, and the income was 45% of GDP. So in this particular year, the Eurozone countries as a whole had government deficit equal to 5% of GDP, roughly. We should note that this was in the middle of the financial crisis, so incomes were relatively low. Of course, this deficit varies from year to year, partly depending on the business cycle, and it also varies a lot across countries. So now we're going to put a government into the model, and it's going to be represented by three variables. The first is G, which we use to denote government consumption and investment. So this is government use of goods for consumption and investment. So in practice, a large part of that will be produced within the government, but we do not take account of that here. We view it as if the government was buying goods in the market from the private firms, to make things simple. And then we have T, which stands for taxes minus transfers, the net amount of money that the government takes from the households. And often we just say taxes, but we should remember that it's taxes minus transfers. And then finally we have capital D, which is net government debt. So the government has debt because it has issued bonds to finance its expenditure, and those bonds are held by households, and that's debt of the government, and the government pays interest on that. But in reality, the government also has some financial assets. In some countries, the government lends money to students for their studies, and then they get a claim on those individuals. The government may also own shares in certain utilities or companies and so on. So when we look at the data, there is a difference between gross and net debt. But here in the model, D is the net government debt. And all these variables are defined in real terms here. We could also do it in nominal terms. So, the public sector budget constraint. Well, we live in an imperfect world where there are such ugly things as budget constraints. There is a limit to how much you can spend, and that applies also to the government. So if the government spends more than its income, it's going to increase its debt. So the change in net debt of the government is going to be the expenditure on consumption and investment, G, minus the tax revenue that you collect, plus the net interest payments that the government makes. And now I've written this in real terms, so we have the real interest rate times the stock of government debt. And just like with the capital stock, the stock of debt, DT, denotes the debt at the beginning of the period. So the change in debt is determined by the public sector deficit, which is G minus T plus R times the initial debt. And G minus T, if we just look at that part, it's called the primary budget deficit. So it's the deficit before interest payments. And often you see that term used in the debate about public finances. So it's good to know. So often you read in the newspaper about the public sector deficit. And of course you wonder, should we be worried about this? How big a problem is it if the government budget shows a deficit? Is that a sustainable situation? Well, one way to look at this is to say the economy is growing, so maybe if debt increases, it's not necessarily a big problem. But if debt increases relative to GDP, then it's not really a sustainable situation. And this is the approach we will take. We will look at whether the government debt is increasing or decreasing relative to income in the economy. Because if debt increases continuously relative to GDP, then some adjustment will be needed. This is not really a sustainable situation if it goes on. So in our analysis, we will focus on the debt ratio, which is the government debt relative to GDP. So to analyze what determines the development of the government debt relative to GDP, we consider a simple situation where there is constant inflation, constant GDP growth, and a constant real interest rate on government debt. And we let little d denote the government debt to GDP ratio, and implicitly we're talking about the net debt, but we just say debt now. So what determines the change in the debt ratio? Well, we just use our very handy rule of thumb for growth rates, saying that the percentage change in the debt ratio is going to be the percentage change in the debt minus the percentage change in income. And the growth in income, we have just assumed it is little g. And then we take that expression and we multiply by the debt ratio, so we get an expression determining the change in the debt ratio as the change in debt divided by GDP minus the growth of income times the debt ratio. And finally, we use the government budget constraint that says that the change in debt is just the primary deficit plus the real interest rate times the level of debt. And we substitute that instead of delta capital D. And then we get an equation that says that the change in the debt ratio is the primary deficit divided by GDP plus the real interest rate minus the growth rate times the debt ratio. Here we have written this equation without the time indices, just in a simple way, so you can remember it. It's a very important person, or well, it's not a person, but it's someone you really have to know if you want to be an economist, it's a very important equation that says that the change in the debt ratio is the primary deficit divided by GDP plus the real interest rate minus the real growth rate times the debt ratio with which you came into the period. And this equation is at the center of all discussions about the sustainability of public finances and the necessary adjustments so as to have the government finances in order. So you could ask, if we want the debt ratio to be stable, what does this imply? Well, it implies that we have to have a primary deficit, which is equal to the growth rate minus the real interest rate by the debt ratio. So if the economy is growing faster than the real interest rate, then actually we can have some primary deficit and still have a stable debt ratio. So, but of course, in the newspapers we often read about the deficit, not the primary deficit. So what does this mean in terms of the deficit? Well, this little calculation here shows that we can write it as the expression on the middle here, that the deficit, which is G minus T plus the nominal interest rate times the debt relative to GDP. So this is the total deficit, including nominal interest payments, relative to GDP. For stable public finances, that can be equal to inflation plus the real growth rate times the debt ratio. And inflation plus the growth rate, that is roughly speaking the growth of nominal GDP. So what does this mean? Let's take an example. Suppose that the real growth is 2%, inflation is 2%, so nominal GDP increases 4% per year. And suppose you initially have a net debt relative to GDP that is 40%. Well, this says that you can have a deficit of 1.6% of GDP and still keep the debt ratio constant. What's the intuition? Well, it's kind of straightforward. Since nominal GDP increases 4% per year, then the net debt can increase also 4% per year and still be constant fraction of GDP. But since net debt was 40% of GDP, a 4% growth of that means an increase in the nominal debt equal to 1.4% of GDP. So the bottom line is that if you read in the newspaper that there is a deficit of 1 or 2% of GDP, you don't need to be sleepless at night. That might very well be a quite stable situation. If you read in the newspapers that the deficit is 8% of GDP or 10% of GDP, then you should be worried, really worried. Now, if you look at the data, there seems to be reason to be worried. In many countries, there has been a quite strong trend upwards in the level of government debt relative to GDP, and there are quite many countries that have a high level of debt. Now we come to the question of whether fiscal policy can be used to stabilize production and employment in the short run. To analyze that, we use the ISLM model, but now we have added a government. If you look at the IS equation, you see that it means two things. The first is that the income that enters the consumption function is now the disposable income of the consumer, Y minus T. And here we have simplified notation by assuming that the government debt is zero initially, so we can neglect the interest payments from the government to the households. And then the disposable income is income minus taxes. And also consumption depends on future expected disposable income, which is expected income minus expected taxes. So that is one difference. The other difference is that we have added G at the end here. Government purchases are a component of demand in the economy. So what happens if we increase public consumption? So G increases. Well, this can be divided into three effects. First, we have a direct effect that a higher public consumption is part of demand, and higher demand in the short run, when prices adjust slowly, will lead to higher production. And then we have the multiplier effect, that as production increases, there will be higher income, and that will lead consumers to increase their consumption, and that leads to a multiplier effect and further increase in demand. And finally, we have a central bank in the background that is setting the interest rate. And it's quite likely that if the government spends more money and this leads to an increase in production, then the central bank will set a higher interest rate than it would otherwise have set. And that counteracts the effect of the fiscal policy, because a higher interest rate will reduce investment and consumption. And this counteracting effect is called crowding out. We say that the government expenditure crowds out private investment and consumption. And the amount of crowding out obviously depends completely on how much the central bank will raise the interest rate. And that will depend on the situation. So this is illustrated here. An expansionary fiscal policy will shift out the IS curve. So production is higher for a given interest rate, but then the central bank will raise the interest rate, typically. So we could ask, how much does the IS curve shift? How large is this effect on aggregate demand, which is captured by the first two parts in this discussion here, the direct effect and the multiplier effect? So we can set up a little algebra to understand that more precisely. So here we assume linear functions in order to be able to do calculations. So we assume that consumption is a linear function of disposable income. Of course, consumption depends on other things, but everything else is now in A0. And investment depends on the interest rate. Higher interest rate means lower investment. And then we have a tax function. So tau is the marginal tax. You have a marginal tax rate times the income, and then you have minus transfers, which is a fixed amount that the government pays out. So if we take those and then we take the goods market equilibrium, y equals c plus I plus g, we substitute in consumption function, investment function, and then we want to solve for production. That means that we first have to multiply in the A1 and the B1 into the parentheses. And then after that, we, so to speak, move all the terms that involve income to the left-hand side. More precisely, mathematically, we subtract A1 times Y and we add A1 times tau times Y on both sides. And then we have all those terms involving income now on the left-hand side. And now we can just rewrite this as a parenthesis times y. And in the parenthesis we have 1 minus a1 plus a1 tau. And then finally we divide by this parenthesis, and now we have that GDP is equal to a multiplier 1 over 1 minus a1 plus a1 tau times the different other components of demand. So now we can calculate the effect of an increase in government expenditure by just taking the differential. So the multiplier for public spending is this. And if we go back, we see that A1 was the marginal propensity to consume. That is how current income affects consumption. So that is a number which is smaller than 1. And since 1 minus a1 is positive and a1 times tau is positive, the multiplier is positive, and its value will depend on these parameters. And we see that the higher the marginal tax, tau, the lower is the multiplier. And of course the reason is that as the government makes purchases, production increases, income increases, and then consumers spend some of that. But if they have to pay some of it in taxes, that will reduce these secondary effects on demand and production. So high marginal taxes will reduce the multiplier effect. If we increase the transfers instead or shift down the tax schedule, then we get a multiplier which is similar, but it has an A1 in here in the numerator. And since A1 is smaller than 1, we see that the effect of a reduction in taxes is smaller. And the reason is that households will save some of this increase in disposable income that they get when you reduce the taxes. Okay, so this suggests that yes, the government can affect the demand and production by changing the government expenditure and transfers and taxes, and potentially fiscal policy can be used to counteract shocks to the economy. However, there is an objection to this argument, which is the so-called Ricardian equivalence theorem. And that says that we should think once more about this. Can we really be sure that consumption will increase if we reduce taxes or increase transfers? Well, very briefly, the argument goes as follows. If we reduce the taxes or increase transfers, household disposable income increases, but households should realize that this increases government debt, and then the government will have to raise taxes in the future to pay interest on the debt and to repay the debt. And if consumers really understand this, then they may not spend the money because they are saying that, well, taxes were reduced today, but they will increase in the future. So the fact that the government reduces the taxes does not make me any richer. So under certain strict conditions, you can derive the Ricardian equivalence result that says that the tax reduction will not increase private consumption. But this holds under fairly strict conditions, and these conditions are discussed in the book. So it is unlikely that Ricardian equivalence holds completely. In a normal situation, you would expect that an increase in government expenditure or a reduction in taxes will have an expansionary effect on the economy, and that is also what the data says. The empirical evidence is discussed in the chapter. Okay, so this chapter introduces the government into the model and studies fiscal policy. We look at the long-run question of whether fiscal policy is sustainable. We look at the short-run question of whether fiscal policy can stabilize the economy. There's also in this chapter a discussion of various practical aspects of fiscal policy. Time delays, it takes time to gather data and to take decisions and for policy to have effects. There's something called the automatic stabilizers. And one concept that is often used is the structural budget deficit, which is the budget deficit you would have if the business cycle situation would be normal. And there's also a discussion of data in this chapter looking at how fiscal policy has developed over time and also at the empirical evidence on the effects of fiscal policy. So there's a lot of debate today about fiscal policy, whether it is effective, and about austerity, criticism of austerity, where governments try to cut expenditures and raise taxes. I think it's fair to say that mainstream macroeconomists do not really think that Ricardian equivalence holds perfectly, but that fiscal policy does affect aggregate demand in the short run. So if we raise taxes or cut government expenditure, then in the short run that will lead to a reduction in aggregate demand and production normally. At the same time, if you have already a very high level of debt and large deficit, this is not really a sustainable situation. Something has to be done to stabilize the situation. So in that kind of situation, you have very difficult policy choices that you face. So if you read this chapter carefully, you will better understand this debate about fiscal policy. Good luck with your studies of chapter 11.